So good afternoon, everyone. And before I begin, I'd like to take a moment, I know we're behind, but just to thank the conference organizers here at the Museo Egizio for all their work, for their commitment especially to this topic, despite the time that has elapsed since the exhibition that inspired it opened, and also for including a medievalist. I was happy to be not the sole medievalist, but for including a medievalist in this very fascinating conversation. I'm delighted to at long last be here. In 2019, a catastrophic fire destroyed the largely 13th century roof and 19th century spire of the Cathedral Notre-Dame of Paris and damaged its medieval and modern stonework. The cathedral's lead roof tiles detached and melted, its oak roof trusses burned, collapsed, broke apart, and fell onto the tops of the limestone vaults below. The needle, or tip, of the massive spire separated from its lower stories and fell westward, crashing through a nave vault and scattering the voussoir of its transverse arch. The rest of the spire fell into the crossing and transept, falling downward, leaving behind a collection of charred timbers. The limestone vaults themselves began to melt, becoming appreciably thinner and thus more fragile as a result. Soot, ash, and toxic lead dust collected on every surface, including the window tracery, stained glass, monumental sculpture, and liturgical furnishings. In addition to bringing about these dramatic changes of state, the fire, I contend, also affected significant changes of status. My paper today explores the relationship between the material Notre-Dame of Paris, shown at left, obviously during the fire, and its purportedly immaterial digital counterpart, shown at right, in the form of a digital double, in French, double numérique, sometimes understood, as we were just learning, as a so-called digital twin, or even, in a slightly different variant, a digital shadow, along with the digital ecosystem recently developed to house it. I argue that the fire triggered a social process that has resulted in an epistemological shift, whereby the damaged fragments of Notre Dame may be understood as architectural relics, the laser surveys themselves as architectural contact relics, and the digital ecosystem developed to store them as an architectural reliquary. In the aftermath of the fire, material scientists, historians, tradespeople, and members of the clergy consciously interpreted and thus deliberately described the altered fragments of lead, oak, and limestone as, quote, remains or vestiges. In French, the word vestige is most frequently used, rather than as rubble or debris, in French, gravats. A recent multi-authored article in a special issue of the Journal of Cultural Heritage nicely documents this version of this interpretation. Consequently, the fragments were systematically recovered, sorted, cataloged, and preserved, and they may eventually be displayed, at least some of them, the ones that are not toxic, in a cathedral works museum, along the lines of existing museums like the Musée de l'Œuvre in Strasbourg or the Palais du Taux in Reims, France. Due to the way the charred remains of the roof, spire, and stonework were treated after the fire, I argue that they underwent a modern version of the process historians of medieval art Cynthia Hahn and Holger Klein have called relicking. In the introduction to their co-edited 2015 volume about relics in the medieval world, Hahn and Klein note that the term they coined, quote, focuses appropriately on an action rather than an object, end quote. In other words, it describes a social process, and one that I submit might obtain just as readily in the present day as it did in the distant past. Specifically, through human responses brought about by the 2019 fire, the way this material was treated, the fragments of Notre Dame became architectural relics. There are notable precedents for understanding architectural elements as relics. For example, in his 12th century CE, Latin text usually translated as on the consecration, Abbot Suger, leader of Saint-Denis, the Benedictine Abbey and royal necropolis north of Paris, described how he understood the building fabric of the existing abbey church, just as he oversaw the modern transformation of its east end, and that's just the term he uses. It's a modern transformation. Around the year 1144, he wrote, quote, "Deliberating under God's inspiration, we chose in view of that blessing, which by the testimony of venerable writing, a legend, right, divine action had bestowed upon the ancient consecration of the church by the extension of his own hand," referring to God or Christ here. "To respect the very stones, sacred as they are, as if they were relics, as if, and to endeavor to ennoble the new edition, which was to be begun under the pressure of so great a need, with the beauty of length and width," end quote. Suger went on to describe exactly how the new design, quote, "respected the old stones," namely the width of the new sanctuary and ambulatory corresponded to the width of the main vessel and side aisles of the much older existing nave. Even if Suger attributed this portion of the building to the time of Christ, a very long time before, we now know it was a Carolingian building that was replaced at this time. This was not an isolated incident in the medieval world. As architectural historian Robert Ousterhout demonstrated in his seminal 2003 article about the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, there was an established tradition of treating works of sacred architecture as relics. In Ousterhout's words, quote, through the course of the Middle Ages, the sanctity and spiritual meaning of a place were assumed, were taken on by the architecture. A monument built to hold the locus sanctus, in English, holy place, came to be regarded both as a reliquary and as a relic in its own right, end quote. In Ousterhout's view, the Holy Sepulchre's irregularities, in particular, are signs that its architecture had come to be regarded as sacred. And through its tumultuous history, the building itself had become a venerated relic. Thus, the stones of the Holy Sepulchre, he continues, were re-employed insofar as possible in each successive reconstruction, even in cases where this leads to kind of what we would see as infelicities or irregularities in the building. And yet, whereas Ousterhout ultimately drew a distinction between the medieval and modern treatments of the stones of the Holy Sepulchre, pointing out that they were scattered around the city by restorers following 20th century intervention, there are noteworthy modern precedents for understanding fragments of Notre-Dame of Paris, specifically, as relics. This is clear from the French and American museums that hold fragments of Notre-Dame in their collections, including the Musée de Cluny, the Musée du Louvre, both in Paris, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, the Art Institute of Chicago, and here, to give one last example, the Nasher Museum of Art at Duke University in Durham, North Carolina. Interestingly, and perhaps unsurprisingly, these fragments are not only sculpted, but also for the most part figural. They have the most kind of visceral impact to a modern beholder. Object labels and didactic texts also identify and authenticate the heads, torsos, trumeau and choir screen or jam figures. If museums are sacred spaces, postmodern sacred spaces as they have occasionally been theorized, then this treatment results in the contemporary equivalent of a medieval treasury. There is also a sculpted fragment purported to come from Notre Dame in my hometown, set into the masonry cladding of Chicago's Tribune Tower, designed in the 1920s, on its most prominent Michigan Avenue facade. Underneath the fragment, separated from it by a horizontal mortar joint, is a boldly carved inscription. The first line reads Notre Dame, and knowing that there are many buildings with this name, the second specifies Paris. Like the parchment labels attached to medieval relics, this inscription at once makes a claim about the origin of this small lithic fragment and authenticates this very claim. The limestone fragment appears to be a leaf from a capital or foliate band, with prominent drill holes visible on either side of the leaf. Not exactly like, but also not entirely unlike, the leaves that do adorn some of the cathedral's capitals, shown here in a recent photograph from the interior of the building while the scaffolding was still up, as the vaults especially were being cleaned. The use of architectural fragments at Tribune Tower has previously been interpreted as an example of spolia, or even out-and-out despoliation, and rightly so. In her 2011 essay on the subject, art historian Annabelle Wharton argued that understanding buildings as bodies with a kind of agency may make such acts of dislocation more visceral for contemporary beholders. While she explicitly dismissed the idea that the Tribune Tower fragments might be relics, I would argue that the Notre Dame fire, 8 years after she was writing, really caused a rupture with this earlier interpretation of fragments of this particular monument. I argue that the relic paradigm is indeed productive for interpreting the fragment said to come from Notre Dame that is embedded in the outer wall of Tribune Tower. Oops. And yet, for the most part, art museums have not yet accessioned what I will call abject architectural remains, like the ones I am primarily interested in here. Where this is starting to happen, however, is at the Cité de l'Architecture et du Patrimoine, the Cultural Heritage Museum in Paris, where a charred timber, mangled lead tiles, and a voussoir from the collapsed transverse arch have all been on display for several months in a temporary exhibition about Notre Dame's conservation and restoration since the 2019 fire. Moreover, just as the stones of the medieval Church of the Holy Sepulchre were treated like relics, so too were the voussoirs of Notre Dame's collapsed transverse arch in particular. When I interviewed them during their most recent visit to the United States, Philippe Villeneuve and Pascal Prunet, two of the architects-in-chief of historic monuments responsible, along with Rémy Froment, for rebuilding Notre Dame, they described the laborious process they undertook with the help of members of a Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique, or CNRS, working group to attempt to reuse some of the original voussoirs in this restoration. The discovery through material analysis of microfissures in the limestone and the sheer difficulty of determining exactly which stone came from which part of the arch really, in the end, rendered this impossible to actually reuse this material in the restored cathedral. But Villeneuve's rhetorical question, which he said, I suppose, kind of in passing, how far should the fetishism of the vestiges go, he asked, makes it clear that the imperative to reuse even the smallest fragments stems from a long-standing impulse to, in Suger's words again, respect the stones, sacred as they are, as if, not saying that they are, but as if they were relics. Of course, relics, whether sacred or secular, architectural or otherwise, are by definition material, are they not? What then of the immaterial Notre Dame promised in the title of my talk? In 2010, Andrew Tallon, the late architectural historian and my former teacher, spearheaded the production of a 3D laser survey of the Cathedral of Paris, collecting roughly 1 billion data points and fixing them in virtual space as XYZ coordinates, in what, as everyone here surely knows, is known as a point cloud. In 2014, the French heritage preservation company Art Graphique et Patrimoine, or AGP for short, also generated a laser survey specifically of the cathedral's wooden roof, which, as you can actually see from this image on the screen, the 2010 laser survey was really not interested in, and therefore it was not very dense in this particular area of the building. The same company, AGP, also produced a complete 3D laser scan shortly after the 2019 fire, mostly as a way to compare before and after, and also to see things like the fact that the vaults had become really significantly thinner through the fire. As the Leica scanner swept the building to produce the first scan in 2010, it emitted a laser that came into contact with the cathedral. This contact enabled the measurement of the distance between points on the cathedral's surface and the scanner itself. It also ultimately made it possible to plot these points in 3 dimensions. The laser scan of Notre Dame is an imprint, in French, empreinte. In his 1997 catalog from the eponymous Centre Pompidou exhibition, Georges Didi Huberman wrote, quote, "A common connotation of an imprint is that its result perdures, that the gesture leaves a, quote, durable mark. In any event, the imprint supposes a support or substrate, a gesture that produces it, in general a gesture that applies pressure, or at least makes contact, and a mechanical result that is a mark. In intaglio or in relief, obviously through all this description, he's clearly thinking mostly of printmaking itself. It is thus a complete technical device. In the matter at hand, it was the laser scan that laser itself that came into contact with Notre Dame, and it left a trace in the form of the point cloud. Moreover, drawing from Theophrid of Ectornox, who died in the year 1110, his treatise Flores Epitaphiae Sanctorum, I argue that the laser surveys themselves, produced in the early 2010s, have been treated like architectural contact relics since the Notre Dame fire. In his treatise, surprisingly, one of precious few medieval texts actually devoted entirely to Christian relics, as much as they were, of course, used and practiced and, kissed and touched, Theophrid suggests that even the, quote, salubrious shadows of the, quote, most glorious bodies of the saints could be considered one type of contact relic, due to the shadow's relationship to contact with, and extension from the saint's body. As he put it in Book 3, Chapter 2, quote, "And what is more glorious, what is more marvelous than the fact that the shadow, which is not substantially of the body of the saint, that is, drives away every adverse condition from body," end quote. Crucially, as architectural contact relics, the laser surveys have an indexical relationship to what we might call the living form of the cathedral, the state before the fire, as it were. That is, they have more in common with the Veronica and its variants than with, say, the Shroud of Turin. Beginning in 2019, a team led by Livio De Luca of the CNRS began assembling the laser surveys and many other forms of cultural heritage data, including photogrammetry and photography, in its own so-called digital ecosystem. Or we could also think about this as a digital twin because of the relationship that it has to actually various forms of the building. De Luca has also just published an article about this promising repository in the same recent special issue of the Journal of Cultural Heritage that I mentioned previously. To extend my metaphor further, if the fragments of lead, oak, and limestone are architectural relics, and the point clouds themselves are architectural contact relics, then it stands to reason that the CNRS's digital ecosystem is a kind of architectural reliquary, as dazzling to us, to contemporary beholders, as a golden, gem-encrusted shrine would have been to medieval viewers. A wealth of art historical scholarship has firmly established that such medieval shrines resembled and could evoke for the learned Christian viewer the heavenly Jerusalem described in chapter 21 of the Apocalypse, or Book of Revelation, described in English translation from the Latin of the Vulgate as follows: "Having the glory of God and the light thereof, was like to a precious stone, as to the jasper stone, even as crystal," end quote. When Pascal Prunet described the Notre-Dame laser scan, he referred to it as an exact imprint. In French, he used the term empreinte exacte. Using a learned metaphor of our own day, namely to classical music, he likened viewing the point cloud within its current digital environment, sort of represented in what you're seeing on the right, to listening to a Mahler symphony, owing to the scan's complexity and vastness. In short, its sublimity. Quote, "All of a sudden you have this enormous thing," he said, "but it needs to be decrypted," end quote. He continued, "It's a recording of the edifice," using the term that you would use to describe a musical recording. Moreover, like a medieval reliquary, Notre Dame's digital twin is similarly microarchitectural. Regardless of the screen we use to view it, it will always be smaller than the, quote, "real thing." Of course, the real thing is also ephemeral, as Paolo Del Vesco rightly reminded us yesterday. Regardless of its claims to objectivity, the point cloud is an index of the state of the building and its context at the time the scan was made. All of the above implies the perceived aura, if not outright sanctity, of the seemingly mundane matter that once constituted the Cathedral of Paris. The architects overseeing the reconstruction and the numerous companies and scientific laboratories making the architect's vision a reality have relied upon the digital double to shore up, conserve, and rebuild the cathedral identically, in French, à l'identique. In this act, architectural relics, architectural contact relics, and architectural reliquary are all working in concert to repair the aura of Notre Dame. Indeed, the instrumental role of the material vestiges themselves, the laser surveys, and the digital double containing them in the rematerialization of the cathedral since the fire of 2019 places the whole endeavor to reconstruct the cathedral on a plane between the material and the immaterial, as if in a liminal space Abbot Suger famously described as being neither completely in the slime of the earth nor completely in the purity of heaven. Thank you.